Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6. See, recently, the Ministry of Finance carried out a review of the monetary policy framework, which is administered by the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, and it has decided to retain the inflation targets that were prescribed under the previous monetary policy framework itself. So this editorial evaluates the decision of the Finance Ministry to retain the monetary policy framework and the inflation target. See, the monetary policy helps in regulating the money supply in the market, which in turn helps in promoting growth or in containing inflation. Because promoting growth and containing inflation, they're conflicting objectives. And when you try to promote growth by increasing money supply, it results in inflation. And when you try to control inflation by sucking the money supply out of the market, then it affects growth. So managing the conflicting objectives of growth promotion and inflation targeting has always been a very difficult task, and it has been administered through the monetary policy which helps in regulating the money supply. Prior to 2016, it was the central bank, that is the RBI, which was solely responsible for the country's monetary policy. Whereas on the other hand, the government was responsible for the fiscal policy, that is the budget, through which the government would be trying to incentivize and promote growth. Prior to 2016, the RBI and the government would quite often run into conflict over decisions related to the monetary policy because the government would be largely interested in promoting growth, even at the slight risk of increasing inflation. And the RBI, which would be more worried about price stability, was excessively focused on inflation targeting through its monetary policy. Before 2016, the monetary policy was at the discretion of the RBI's governor, and quite often conflicts would emerge between the RBI governor and the government over the priorities of the monetary policy. So, to make the monetary policy more broad based, the government decided to amend the RBI Act in 2016, and it provided for the establishment of the Monetary Policy Committee. This committee is chaired by the RBI governor and assisted by members who represent both the RBI and the government. This committee was given the task to administer the country's monetary policy framework. And under this framework in 2016, the government clearly laid out an inflation target for the RBI, that is for the Monetary Policy Committee. And accordingly, it was given the task to maintain inflation at 4% with a range of plus or minus 2%. This monetary policy framework was applicable from 2016 to 2021, and it provided for additional flexibility with a range of plus or minus 2% in order to allow the Monetary Policy Committee to factor in any emergency and extraordinary situations which would require the aggressive intervention of the RBI. So from 2016 to 2020, the Monetary Policy Committee was very successful in keeping inflation under check within the prescribed target range. But unexpectedly, India and the world had to face an unprecedented situation last year, which was triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. As the pandemic-led lockdowns led to a devastating crash in the Indian economy, the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI was forced to make use of this flexibility in the policy framework and deploy the key policy rate, that is the repo rate, to significantly increase money supply in order to boost growth, which had hit the negative territory as a result of the lockdowns. But as expected, this large-scale infusion of money supply into the market was bound to trigger inflationary pressures. And over the last few months, India has been witnessing rising inflation. For the month of February, CPI inflation stood at a staggering 5.03%. And over the last few months, inflation has been hovering in the range of 5 to 7%. This inflation has been driven by volatility in food and fuel prices, and as well as by the shortage of key raw materials, which has affected production in the industry. So the current inflationary trend that we are witnessing in the Indian economy is no longer seasonal or temporary, and it is indicating towards a more general price rise in the economy. Because the rising prices of food, fuel, and essential raw materials is having a spillover effect across various sectors of production, resulting in a generalized increase of costs. So at this crucial juncture, the monetary policy framework came up for review after a period of 5 years. And in a landmark decision, the government has decided to retain the monetary policy framework as it was for the previous period and for the next 5 years as well, that is between 2021 and 26. The monetary policy framework has been given with the same inflation target. The Monetary Policy Committee has been directed by the government to stick to the inflation targets that were prescribed previously. And this clearly indicates that the policy makers, both at the government and the RBI, have made inflation targeting the very centerpiece of the monetary policy framework. The editorial praises the government and the RBI for their exclusive focus on price stability because sustained inflation in the economy is going to result in price volatility, which not only destabilizes the macroeconomic factors but also has a devastating impact on the purchasing power of the common man. Various studies conducted by the RBI have also insisted that we need to continue our focus on inflation targeting, and it is better for India to adopt a flexible targeting framework which provides much leeway for the Monetary Policy Committee to judicially exercise the policy rates, such as repo rate, to trigger growth and contain inflation depending on the economic circumstances. Various RBI studies have pointed out that trend inflation should be held in the range of 4.1 to 4.3%, because anything less than this will push the Indian economy towards a deflationary situation, and anything above this might affect growth. And when the RBI intervenes to push money supply in order to boost growth, it will lead to serious inflation, which could deliver price shocks to the macroeconomy. So, in this context, various RBI studies had clearly pointed out that the central concern and the primary focus of the monetary policy framework should always be inflation targeting with a flexible range. In line with these studies, the policy makers at the government and the RBI have taken the right decision, and by retaining the same monetary policy framework and the inflation target, they have sent out the right message for both investors and savers. Because inflation not only affects the large investors, but also the common man who invests in small saving schemes. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 that is related to the recent resolution of the United Nations Human Rights Council against Sri Lanka. We have discussed in recent sessions that Sri Lanka was targeted at the UNHRC with a resolution sponsored by the Western countries. This resolution accused the Sri Lankan government, that is the then Rajapaksa government, of committing war crimes and human rights violations during the last phase of the civil war, which was fought between 2006 and 2009 between the Sri Lankan forces and the Tamil militant outfits such as the LTTE. It has been widely reported that during this last phase of the civil war, the Sri Lankan government headed by Mahinda Rajapaksa had committed gross human rights violations of the Tamil minorities in the northern and eastern provinces, and the Sri Lankan armed forces stood accused of committing grave war crimes. During the latest resolution that was brought up, India and several other countries abstained from the vote, whereas close allies of Sri Lanka, such as China, Pakistan and the others, they supported Sri Lanka and they voted against the resolution. But despite this, the resolution passed through with Western support, and accordingly, a mechanism is being created under the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, authorizing this institution to collect and preserve evidence against the Sri Lankan government and the armed forces on account of war crimes and human rights violations allegedly committed during this period. The writer argues that this face-off at Geneva, where the UNHRC is headquartered, brought two different strands of the Sri Lankan society into conflict, which involved the defense of Sri Lanka by the Sinhala Buddhist majority, leading to a targeting of this UNHRC resolution by the Sinhala nationalists, and at the same time, widespread support to the resolution by the Tamil minorities and the Muslim minorities of Sri Lanka, who feel oppressed and targeted at the hands of the Sinhala Buddhist majority. While the pace of the UNHRC resolution picked up at Geneva, all major powers were involved in a geopolitical power play to either support Sri Lanka or to target Sri Lanka. While this geopolitical face-off was being witnessed in Geneva, the Sinhala nationalists and the Tamil nationalists also witnessed a face-off as they tried to defend their respective rights and interests. The Sinhala nationalists saw this resolution as an attack on the country's honor and sovereignty, and they targeted the Western countries for sponsoring such a resolution by calling out those countries for their double standards and hypocrisy when it comes to the defense of human rights. The Sinhala nationalists alleged, both within Sri Lanka and abroad, that this was a selective targeting of Sri Lanka based on geopolitics, and they alleged that this was a conspiracy by the Western countries to target the Sri Lankan government, which was becoming closer to China. At least a part of this argument of the Sinhala nationalists is true because any UNHRC resolution goes through a geopolitical power play. Now just look at India's decision with regard to voting on this resolution. On one side, India was driven by its commitment to uphold the rights and the well-being of the Tamil minorities and to secure justice to the victims of war crimes. While India was bound by these ideals and moral obligations, it also had to take into account its strategic interest in the Indian Ocean, because in order to offset China, which had already become closer to the Sri Lankan government, India also had to support the Sri Lankan government in some way or the other. In the end, India decided to strike a balance and it decided to abstain from the vote, thereby signaling support to the Tamil minorities and as well as to the Sri Lankan government. So in any decision at the UNHRC, there is definitely some geopolitics involved. It is not that the Western countries have always remained consistent when it comes to defending human rights, and they have shown double standards and selective targeting based on their respective geopolitical interests. But however, for the Tamil minorities of Sri Lanka and even the Muslim minorities of late who have come under attack by the Sinhala Buddhist majority, this was a question of justice and their fight for equality and reconciliation. Especially for the victims of the civil war and the minority civilians who have been targeted and discriminated for decades together, it was a hard-won fight for justice, and they eventually hoped that this resolution would even lead to proceedings against the Sri Lankan government at the International Criminal Court on the grounds of war crimes and genocide. While these ambitions of Tamil nationalists was not realized, the adoption of the UNHRC resolution did highlight a lot of support amongst the international civil society and the Tamil diaspora abroad. Because once such matters get adopted by the global civil society and by the diaspora members of that community, such resolutions and movements against authoritative governments, they acquire a life of their own. And in fact, until 2014, all these factors were against the Sri Lankan government. Because following the end of the civil war, the Mahinda Rajapaksa government did not acknowledge the allegations of war crimes and human rights violations, leading to the targeting of the Sri Lankan government by the Western countries, the international civil society, and as well as by the Tamil diaspora. So in 2012, 13 and 14, Sri Lanka faced many hostile resolutions at the UNHRC. But finally in 2015, there was a breakthrough for Sri Lanka because the change in government allowed Sri Lanka to strike a middle path on this contentious issue. And the Maitripala Sirisena government that followed the Rajapaksa government decided to co-sponsor this UNHRC resolution. So in 2015, the then Sri Lankan government became a part of Resolution 30/1, and as a result, the hostility in the Western countries and the international civil society towards the Sri Lankan government reduced because there was hope that the Sri Lankan government would finally act responsibly and deliver justice and reconciliation to the victims of civil war. But unfortunately, despite Sri Lanka's decision to co-sponsor the resolution, there was no impact on the ground and there was no honest effort made to set up an independent investigation into these allegations of war crimes. Then in 2020, the Rajapaksa brothers returned back to power and immediately Sri Lanka withdrew from this resolution. As soon as Sri Lanka withdrew from the resolution, the hostility from the West and from the global civil society and the Tamil diaspora came back into the picture and it was targeted at the Sri Lankan government again. This is what resulted in this year's resolution against Sri Lanka, and this time the Sri Lankan government had alienated the entire UNHRC, Western countries, the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and as well as several other countries which are often considered to be friends of Sri Lanka. Despite active lobbying by China, Pakistan, and Bangladesh on Sri Lanka's behalf, many countries, even Muslim countries of the OIC, failed to support the Sri Lankan government, and even they abstained from voting, just like India. Now, let's take up an article from page number 10. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has brought out the National Policy for Rare Diseases 2021. See, there are around 7,000 to 8,000 rare diseases around the world, which are usually an outcome of genetic disorders and genetic defects. But these diseases are so rare that they lack a market, and hence it becomes very difficult or almost impossible to find diagnosis, treatment, and care for these diseases. So, for patients suffering from rare diseases, treatment is either non existent, or if it exists, it happens to be very, very expensive. The cost of treating such rare diseases could run into several lakhs or crores of rupees. And forget poor families, even the rich and the upper class won't be able to afford this treatment. So, to provide some sort of relief to those who are suffering from rare diseases, the government has come out with a national policy to replace the earlier policy of 2017. Under the new policy, the government promises to fund the one-time treatment of patients with rare diseases through the Ayushman Bharat Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. Under the previous policy, the government was extending support up to 15 lakh rupees, but under the new policy, this amount has been increased to 20 lakh rupees. This government support would be available to those who are suffering from rare diseases that have been classified as Group 1 diseases under the policy. See, there are several types of rare diseases that arise out of genetic disorders and defects. For example, we have primary immunodeficiency disorders, lysosomal storage disorders, small molecule inborn errors of metabolism, cystic fibrosis, osteogenesis, muscular dystrophies, and spinal muscular atrophy. Some of these diseases can be cured with one-time treatment. Some of the diseases have treatment that's available, but still it's very difficult to access the treatment. And there are other kinds of diseases for which the patient requires lifelong treatment. So the policy classifies these rare diseases into Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. Under Group 1, those rare diseases which can be cured with one-time treatment have been included, and only these Group 1 rare diseases receive financial support from the government. Under Group 2, those diseases which have treatment but not readily accessible, they have been classified, and the government might be willing to support these treatments as well on a case-to-case basis. But however, the biggest drawback of the policy is that Group 3 patients who suffer from lifelong conditions have been completely excluded from the policy. That's the reason why caregivers and activists who work for these patients, they've criticized the government's policy because it has excluded the most vulnerable group which requires lifelong support and treatment. The policy offers no support to Group 3 patients, and the promised financial support is largely limited to Group 1 diseases. But however, the government has justified the policy by stating that when it comes to treatment of rare diseases, they are very expensive and cost prohibitive, and hence the government is forced to strike a balance between optimizing financial resources and providing the right kind of healthcare and support to the patients. But the merits of the policy is that the financial support extended to Group 1 diseases is not just limited to BPL families. Instead, the criteria covers nearly 40% of the population as per 23 eligibility norms that have been laid down under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. The government has also said that it is going to assist the civil society and the NGOs in raising crowdfunding for these patients, as the money required to treat these conditions is extremely high. Now let's take up an article from page number 14. Government asks PSU refiners to review Saudi oil deals. See, as you all know, India is a net importer of crude oil. As India doesn't have sufficient reserves of its own, it imports nearly 85% of its crude oil requirement. Majority of these imports come from West Asian countries and from the members of OPEC grouping, which functions as a cartel of oil producing nations that determine production in order to artificially control the global oil prices. This OPEC grouping is dominated by Saudi Arabia, and there is also an expanded grouping of the OPEC known as the OPEC Plus. And these two cartels of oil producing nations, they determine the oil production levels and thereby the global oil prices. India imports nearly 60% of its crude oil requirements from West Asian countries, and the rest is sourced from Latin America, Africa, Russia, and the United States. Most of India's procurement from these countries is based on term contracts, which is a fixed annual contract that provides for supply reliability to India. Under these term contracts, the buyer would have agreed to lift a certain predefined quantity of crude oil, and the buyer will have an obligation to buy this quantity at any cost. The buyer will also have to give an advance notice to the seller, and the buyer is also charged the official selling price, which is an average selling price determined by the selling countries. And usually it is higher than the market spot price, because if the price during the time of loading is charged, then the buyer would be able to enjoy the benefits of any dip in oil prices. But these benefits are not available under term contracts, and the buyer will have to lift the oil at a predetermined official selling price. So these term contracts or fixed annual contracts are usually against the buyer, whereas it provides a lot of advantages to the seller. While the buyer has an obligation to lift the load, the seller can deny or even cut or reduce supplies if the OPEC grouping decides on any production cut. But for several decades, India has come to depend upon term contracts due to its import dependency, because India's primary priority was supply reliability. So for the sake of supply reliability, India had to compromise on price, and it was even left vulnerable to the supply shocks coming from the producing countries. Last year, when the pandemic broke out and countries went into a lockdown, the demand for crude oil fell to a historic low, and as a result, the oil prices collapsed. To prevent this from happening and to stabilize the oil prices, the OPEC plus countries led by Saudi Arabia decided to cut production of oil for several months in order to artificially boost up the global oil prices. As of February 2021, economic activity around the world has started to pick up, and oil prices have again started shooting. But this, of course, works to the disadvantage of India, because India is a net importer of oil. So as the oil prices started rising and as the demand for oil went up, India appealed to Saudi Arabia and the OPEC grouping to not continue the production cut in order to increase oil supply in the market so that the prices could be brought down. But these concerns and demands of India were ignored and neglected by the suppliers, especially by Saudi Arabia. And hence, India has decided to retaliate, and it has asked the public sector units, that is Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum and Hindustan Petroleum, to start diversifying the oil sources for India by sourcing crude oil from other markets and other suppliers other than West Asian countries and OPEC countries. And it has also directed these companies to look out for supplies at market prices which are offered at spot markets. In spot markets, the prices are determined on a daily basis based on international prices, and purchasing oil directly from spot markets will provide Indian refiners with greater price flexibility. Previously, India had reduced its exposure to spot markets because they are not reliable sources of supply, whereas fixed annual contracts were guaranteeing reliable supplies, but it came with a disadvantage of higher price and higher unpredictability. But now that India is a leading importer, and now that India's oil industry has matured a lot, the Indian government has started to flex its muscle, and it has directed the oil refiners to diversify the oil sources to India and as well as start purchasing from spot markets, where they can strike the best deals based on daily international prices. 1 decade ago, only 20% of India's crude oil imports were being lifted from spot markets, because the focus back then was not on price flexibility, but it was more on supply reliability. But now, 30 to 35% of India's crude oil imports are being lifted from spot markets, which gives the oil refiners greater price flexibility and better deals to India. So due to a lack of response from Saudi Arabia and the OPEC grouping, the government has directed the PSU refiners to continue this strategy of lifting more oil from the spot markets. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: Evaluate the latest review of RBI's inflation targeting framework. The second question, the Human Rights Council is where Sinhala and Tamil nationalisms meet and confront each other. Analyze the statement. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.